Welcome back to another episode of the Max Term Podcast, and happy contract projection day to all who celebrate. AFPAnalytics contract projections are now live at AFPAnalytics on X, pin tweet, can't miss them. Take a look, pull out your favorite teams, tweet out about your favorite teams, get some engagement going. Maybe we'll put together kind of a projection. This is what we probably should do. Each team maybe we'll put together and then sound off. Find your team in our tweets over the week or two after they come out, and give us your opinion, your thoughts on the players, stuff like that.
Tell us how wrong we are.
Yeah, tell us how wrong we are. I'm sure we're going to be wrong. There's some players
we'll get some chuckles out of it too. So that
yeah. There's some that we'll be told we're really wrong with, and then you'll have a T meme coming at you down the road, and then vice versa. You can give us a T meme occasionally too if you do call it correctly. So this episode's kind of designed to talk through we're going to focus on just unrestricted free agents, probably bigger names towards the top of the class, maybe get down a little bit. We're recording this a little bit before we finalized everything, but most of our projections have been run. Most we're pretty confident with. I think there'll be one player we'll talk through where we have a couple numbers that we're deciding between. Talk through that. But yeah, this episode is just kind of designed to give our thoughts on kind of as we went through the process, where we feel, how we feel about certain players, certain projections, where we kind of expect to be wrong, where we think we feel pretty good, some of the comps, some of the contracts we may sign, like we would be all over if we were a team, some that we think are fair, some that caution or stop sign that we would put up with. So that's kind of the purpose of this episode. So again, at AFPAnalytics on X is where all those are found. Appreciate you listening. Max Term Podcast, all major podcast platforms. Give us a subscription as well. So contract projections. I was responsible for a good chunk of the UFAs, at least initially running them. That does not mean that we don't check each other's work and stuff, but UFAs were basically my projection. But I think with that in mind, I think it makes more sense to give the floor to you to start with your overall thoughts, because I probably dove more into the micro level of a lot of these and scrutinize these a little bit more. So your overall thoughts on the UFA kind of class, forwards, defensemen, stuff like that.
Yeah, so just to touch really broadly on the unrestricted free agent class, and we mentioned this in a previous episode, but you need a winger, great. Center is going to be a little concerning, just the amount of options out there, but also now that we've run the contracts, I will say a little concerning contract-wise, the amount of money you might need to commit and maybe even term. You need defensemen. We'll say on average you're looking for a second pair defenseman. You've got plenty of options. And then goalies, if you are looking for even a 1B, like there might be a couple options, but it's a little iffy. That's kind of my broad view of the entire class. And honestly, I think we should just start at the top. Sam Reinhart. And this is an interesting one just right off the bat because of the situation. Career year, playing for Florida, which we're all about the advantages of no state income tax. You landed on a projection of 8 years, which would be him staying with his team. Well,
or sign and trade type situation.
Yep. So 8 years at about 11.3 AAV, which, I mean, good for Sam Reinhart, because even a few years ago, I don't think anyone would have seen that coming at that point. I think he's worth it if he hits the UFA market. I think he's worth that number. It puts him in the same ballpark of the Nylander, I almost said Pasta, but Pasternak. Under Panarin, well,
Under all
Yeah.
three of those guys you just listed.
Slightly under Nylander and Pasternak, definitely under Panarin, but still kind of in the same grouping, which based off of this year, I believe it was 57 goals in the regular season. He's deserving of that type of contract. I think the biggest question, before I let you comment on this, biggest question is going to be if he wants to stay in Florida. That number could lower somewhat significantly because of the advantages of Florida.
Yeah. So we ran midseason projections, and we had run those shortly, or our data was pulled shortly before William Nylander had signed. So if you were looking at those and you're looking at, oh, well, Reinhart's now up some, was it because he was better? Well, it's not to say that he sustained his level of excellent play throughout the season, but now the Nylander contract comes in to help drive this projection up a little bit. So if you're looking kind of comparing midseason to now, a lot of it comes down to there's just another higher end comp to pull it up with William Nylander. I think that Sam Reinhart is absolutely worth this money, but I think you're 100% right. I could see us being very wrong in that when you're comparing what he actually signs to our projection because of the Florida factor. He probably comes in $2 million lower per year if he signs in Florida. And I also want to mention he should have been a Selke finalist. He was that good. So he scored 57 goals, but was equally as good defensively and probably should have been a finalist over Matthews. And this might be a little bit hot, but like defensively, his numbers were better than Barkov's, his teammates. But that I can't argue too much against, but like he should have been a finalist over Austin Matthews.
The other thing to mention, because I did mention the goals primarily, this defensive play from Reinhart, this level is new for him, but dating back to Buffalo, he was a very good defensive forward. So it's not all of a sudden he's with Florida and like these great defensive numbers are coming for Reinhart. That's amazing. Those have always been there. It was the 57 goals that, and even last year his goal scoring was up a bit from his time in Buffalo. He is an all-around player, and he's very good at everything. It's not he's solid here and elite somewhere else. He's elite at pretty much anything you want to ask him to do. I don't think any team does it, but he's had the flexibility to play center in the past. I don't think anyone brings him in specifically to play center, but I think there's some value to that flexibility or versatility, if you want to say that. But I think we pretty much just went over all the reasons that he's the top free agent on the board.
Yeah, I wanted to get to the center experience point as well. They're signing him exclusively thinking he's going to play wing. But if they were to have like their second line center get injured and not have necessarily the depth in their organization to slide someone up, or just lineup wise want to move him over or down, you'll be fine for a stretch. Yeah. So that gives him definitely a little bit more value. So I wouldn't be shocked if this projection is very wrong, but I actually feel really good about the true market value for Reinhart.
Yes.
And I think if he does go elsewhere, Utah and Seattle are probably my two favorite locations. Both of those teams have a lot of cap space. So does Nashville. I think those would be my three choices. Those three teams all have a lot of cap space, and he has not been paid like an elite player that he kind of is his entire career. So if he chooses to hit the open market, he should have suitors who are going to be willing to give him at least this much, if not more.
I think that's honestly the perfect way to wrap up Reinhart. So moving to our next, I guess, next ranked player as far as cap hit.
I think that's the best way to put it as far as cap hit.
Yeah. Jake Gensel, very good offensive player. not the greatest defensive player. So you're pretty much getting, I don't know, you're getting an elite goal scorer, which you could almost argue every single team needs that. But you need to be okay with, like, this guy's not going to have great defensive impacts. He might actually hurt us a little bit defensively. Our projection, 7 years, $9.25 million, just about. Some people, I think, expect maybe even a little more. Some think maybe a little less. At the end of the day, he's just a very consistent offensive player, putting up a large amount of points. I think there were people who kind of wondered at the time of the trade, well, how's he going to do without Crosby? He's going to do very well still, at least offensively, without Crosby. So I think that kind of helped keep his value up high. So I will say this is probably the first contract, and with it being contract number 2 that we're talking about, it's interesting, but this is the first one I'm going to say it could be worth it, but you need to be cautious and understand that there are some issues with his game defensively.
Looking as I was kind of running and trying to get to a final number here, Reinhart fell into place very easily.
Yeah.
Getzel, I struggled with, and we always have this push and pull of what are we trying to accomplish, what we think they should sign for, what we would sign them for versus what their market value versus what we think a team will sign. Like, there's always a push and pull into what we're trying to accomplish, and I had to do my best to try to reflect what his market value probably is. I wouldn't touch this contract. This takes him to 37 years old, closing in on it's over $9 million for a player that age who, as you said, has been a very good goal scorer, but that's about it. Like, I'm not touching this contract. I think it's okay. I don't think it's high market value wise, but I think it's high. I think a team should be trying to get him for less. I don't think a team's able to get him for less.
I think it's also important to point out, and this is kind of just roster building 101, contracts 101. The first 3-4 years of this contract are probably going to be Jake Guentzel. You're going to get your top scorer. Eventually, there will be some decline. That could be the second half of this deal, and the defensive game is already poor. So, yeah, I don't really have an argument other than he scores a lot of goals and is pretty good offensively to counter what you just said. A very good defensive team who needs goal scoring, it could make sense. That's kind of how I think this has worked so well with Carolina. This was a very, very good defensive team that acquired him that can pretty much make up for his defensive issues, and they're still getting the elite offensive play. That's the type of team that may need to go, well, I shouldn't say it needs to go get him. That's probably the best type of team for a Jake Guentzel, especially at this type of contract, because all of those issues that could end up making the cap hit look bad minimized a little bit on a very good defensive team.
Do you want to stick with forwards or kind of continue down our list?
Let's stick with forwards, and then we can jump back.
I like that, yep.
Believe it or not, this is kind of a polarizing player at this point, I think, as far as contract, what's it going to look like.
We got a couple of those coming up, so...
Yeah, but actually, I don't even want to say but. Okay, Elias Lindholm. Real solid player, viewed as a first-line center, and then last season happened, which maybe even before that you could look at some underlying numbers and see, okay, maybe he's not quite that first-line center, but last season, so previous to this past one, point production dropped. This season, point production low. He gets traded to Vancouver, does not fit in. We're recording this. The playoffs are still going on. As of right now, Vancouver's still alive. He's actually having a pretty solid playoffs. And he's looking like one of the better players one of the better forwards for Vancouver.
Let me add a quick, just general so our data that we use for this, regular season data.
Yes.
But the fact that we're running these kind of around the midpoint of the playoffs gives us an opportunity to make kind of some adjustments a little bit based on how playoff performance is going, just intrinsically, I guess would be the word to kind of say there.
Yeah.
So the playoff performance numbers are not necessarily factored in, but the kind of positive, kind of the playoff vibes, if you will, are factored in a little bit for a lot of these projections because we're tweaking them up until they go live or have gone live, basically. So just wanted to get that disclaimer in a little bit quickly.
Yep. So to the specific contract, I want to start with when we ran an extension for him mid-season. We had 7 years at about $8 million. That's very much so. It's not franchise level first line center, but that's first line center money. Full season of data. We all saw what happened with Vancouver. We're ending up with a projected contract of 5 years at about 6.75. Really tough situation to read, tough player to read. The overarching issue here is the center market is thin. And there's even some other names that might be perceived as top names who very much so have their issues as well. So if you need a we'll say top 6 center, Lindholm might be one of your best options. Are you comfortable at 5 years, 6.75?
So he's one that we scrutinized, kind of actually reran, like really scrutinized comps. I was initially a touch lower. I think I was closer to like 6.3, 6.4, if I remember correctly, on I think 5 years as well. We after looking at comps a little bit more, scrutinizing who made sense, who didn't make sense, we bumped them up a little bit. I'll say that the 6.3 that I had originally had was probably a little too good to be true. But this is probably pushing a little of where my comfort level.
Yeah.
To me, if I can get him like 6.5, I'm probably happy. So as you laid out the fact that the center market's thin, this probably makes sense. I don't know if I'm signing up for this as a team, but I think the number kind of makes sense at this point. But I think there are teams out there that are fine doing it. Boston Bruins are probably number one for me.
Yeah, I agree. I think it makes sense to talk about centers right now.
Yes, yeah. So we have probably 2 other perceived we'll get there.
There's
yes.
one name that you're probably thinking, and we don't consider him a center, so we're going to skip and get back to him later, I think.
Yeah.
So first name up so Lindholm was our first center on the market at 5 by 6.75. Second center, Sean Monahan. We've got, we've got 4 years at about 5.3. Pretty much had a bounce back year offensively. Still viewed as a decent defensive guy. His numbers were down a little bit in Montreal, and they improved a little in Winnipeg. Biggest issue with Monahan is almost not even the AV, it's term. So we had 4 years. I think initially we were in the 5-year bucket, and he just put together a full season, but he had struggled to do so for multiple seasons prior. And we ended up coming to a group of comps that made sense to get him to 4 years. How do you feel about Sean Monahan?
I feel good about the average annual value we have. I feel quite good about that. I like where that kind of settled in. We were pretty close, like after you had reviewed and scrutinized a little bit more. You were still pretty close to what I had AAV wise. Again, It was the term. I would not be surprised if he did get a 5th year. I really wouldn't, based on the market and his personal situation, just being able to lock into a contract given everything he had went through. I wouldn't be shocked if both player and team kind of are okay with making that happen. And he might be, quote unquote, sacrificing a little AAV to get a 5th year by staying like at that 5 to 5.3-ish range. But I think situationally for him, there could be he could do it, and I think a team maybe could be on board to keep the value down a little, the cap hit down a little bit. So I feel pretty good about where our projection is at for Monahan. That's a good second-line center contract.
Yeah.
Or at least a fair second-line center contract. I'm not going to say...
Honestly, it's... with the cap now rising, that's getting close to a number that even 3Cs
an elite like 3C
start
exactly
to be making. So it's not bad, and I do agree, and I think we can't overstate the fact that it's a thin center market. So it's very possible that just the way things go in free agency, teams bidding, it pushes him up into a 5th year. It wouldn't be a shock.
No. And we have comps that justify the 5th going 5. We also obviously have comps that justify the 4, and that's where we ultimately settled. The other one in the same range that we, as recording, we are still having an issue with where we want to settle. I think the contract projections that are live on at AFPAnalytics on X is what we're sticking with. But as we're recording this, we're again recording a little bit before releasing, and we're going to be probably scrutinizing this one down to the wire. It's Chandler Stevenson, who right now, as of this recording, we have 4 years, $5 million AAV. We're wrestling between that and an extra year and another like 500-ish thousand average annual value potentially.
So I will say this is kind of what we had mid-year to what we're thinking now. Mid-season, our extension projection was 5 years, 5.7 or 5.8. So that's kind of the range that we're looking at right now for Stevenson.
Yeah, and I think when we were discussing it over text last night, I used the phrase, dude dropped off a cliff this year.
Yeah, and I think I responded with, I don't know if he was ever too high up on the cliff, or some version of words that would imply that. Points-wise, dropped off a cliff. Underlying numbers dropped off a cliff, but they turned bad. And looking back the past couple of seasons where he put together his bigger seasons, his 60-point seasons, his underlying numbers were very average. Like, they weren't bad, but they weren't good. And that's a little concerning to me, especially on a team like Vegas. So the fact that he dropped off a cliff this year, headed into free agency, looking at these contracts, so we had 5 by 5.7 as an extension mid-year. Nothing happened towards the end of the year to really raise that. You could almost argue things happened to lower it. But again, the center market's very thin, and there are for sure teams that will view him as a second-line center. So the question that we're I guess, ultimately struggling with, because we haven't finished up his projection yet, is kind of the stats versus perception battle that we have with a number of players. Ultimately, I think regardless of what we really decide on, it's a player I'd pass on signing.
Yes, I think it's a player I fully agree pass on. And if of these players that we've already talked about, if we're going to be low on someone, he's number one, and he might be maybe not number one in the entire like pool, but he's going to be top 5 of who signs for a bigger contract probably than our projection.
Yeah, and I kind of want to go full circle with the centers we've talked about. So Lindholm, Monahan, and Stevenson. There's what we think should happen, which I think we kind of have our order. It would not shock me if any one of those 3 had the highest cap hit.
Yeah, if a team thought that one of those 3 is their guy,
yeah,
and wants to make sure they get their guy, yes. And
Stevenson's probably
least likely.
Well, he's probably the more polarizing player of the 3. So I mean, in our eyes, he's least likely, but there again might be teams that saw 2 60-point seasons and say, well, last season was a fluke. So I don't know. We'll see. And they all have different issues. So it's not even a perfect apples to apples that we're comparing 3 centers. So I don't know. But that's kind of that's the top 3 centers. It's going to be the top 3 centers on our board. Yeah, I don't love the center market for any team that desperately needs one.
So let's transition into a borderline center, but this will be another group of players that, okay, 2 of these are other prime candidates to be low on. We're going to call these the older, wily, coming off big production seasons, but also could take a lot less to potentially get into a good situation, but also maybe could get paid a lot more because a team that's not a contender is looking to attract them to their organization. Patrick Kane, Jonathan Marchessault, Steven Stamkos. So let's talk about those 3 because grouping wise, they make sense to talk about together.
So in my head, I almost separate these players into 2 groups, and I consider all 3 of those guys wingers. I want to make that clear. That's what I was hinting at before. Stamkos is a winger at this point. I think our contract projections separate this slightly, like 2 guys together, one slightly lower. Some interesting reasons that aren't necessarily about the performance. So we've got Patrick Kane at the top of those 3 on a 2-year deal at about 6.3. Marchessault comes in right with him.
Exact same AAV, actually.
Exact same AAV, just 1 extra year. Marchessault being a little bit younger, less injury concerns as well. I don't think there really are, at the moment, injury concerns with Marchessault other than he's an
34.
Aging player.
Yeah, 34 years old. Yeah.
Kane, there's very much concerns, which he got through this season once he came back without really any issue. But you still have to consider it. And I think that's where some comps led us to a shorter contract. But those 2 guys came off great seasons. Kane rebounded as far as underlying numbers defensively, and Marchessault scored 40 plus. So those are both 2 wingers. Personally, I'd probably be fine with those contracts. Anytime you're signing a 2 to 3 year deal, it's not insignificant, but it's fairly low risk. It's not the same as signing Jake Gensel to 7 years. And they're coming off 2 great seasons. Marchessault had a great team. I almost am more impressed with Kane's season because 1, the injury came off of, and 2, the team he was playing on was at times good, but overall not the greatest. So those two I'm fine with. Steven Stamkos, and I mentioned the contracts kind of put them in different groups. He's not much lower. So we ended up with a 3-year projection at about 6.1. Now this is one where when I look at our list, I say we could be very off here. There is the fact that Stamkos has always played for the Lightning. He's their captain. We can loop in Florida, no income tax. He could take lower in general, even not considering the income tax situation, because he wants to stay with the team. He's a player that I believe he also scored 40 plus. His underlying numbers are not good at 5-on-5. He's still a very good power play player. He's kind of the same office as Ovechkin. If you're a team who really needs to improve their power play and wants some leadership brought in, could be a great fit. But similarly to when I was cautioning about Gensel, I want to caution about Stamkos that at 5v5, you shouldn't expect much. As far as positive impacts, you will still see some points probably, but not the greatest player. On top of that, Tampa Bay has reportedly looked at differing contract options to keep players.
Yeah, that's where I was kind of going to get at is if Stamkos signed something like 8 years, $3 million, so that gets him more money total, but a lot lower cap hit. That's supposedly what they were trying to do with Alex Killorn last offseason. And obviously he ended up going to Anaheim. But if they tried to do the same thing with Stamkos, try to get him as much as the same or more total value, but spread it out farther, I wouldn't be shocked. I would not be shocked at all. That makes us very wrong. So we could be very wrong being way too high. As you talked about, a team could really fall in love with the idea and to attract him away, much like Anaheim seemingly did with Alex Killorn. Give him a big contract, and we could be very low.
Yeah.
The Stamkos projection, I think, kind of was us not committing to one of those two directions and kind of falling in the middle. In that, here's where it could end up. I actually like a lot of the comps that we have. The one comp that's in there that we debated heavily, and still heck, maybe we still decide to take him out after talking through it, is Ryan O'Reilly's contract in Nashville. Like, those players, okay, they're not the same player whatsoever, but they're also not dissimilar from a lot of intangibles.
Yes.
And a lot of things that, a lot of reasons a team would sign one of those players. Again, Stamkos scores a lot more, but O'Reilly's a much bigger, better two-way forward.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't like taking him out as a comp because, yes, they're vastly different, but O'Reilly's impacts on the underlying game is a lot stronger than Stamkos. Stamkos has a lot bigger impact in the box score.
Yeah, and there's some other comps that I will say they're better 5-on-5 underlying numbers. Pavelski, Stastny, Killorn's in there. Koivu, I think, was in there. But at the end of the day, it's not just those 5-on-5 numbers. Stamkos still produced at an elite level. He was still very good on the power play, and we try and factor in intangibles as we can. So in that sense, that makes Pavelski, Stastny, Koivu, Killorn. It fits. So when I look at 3 years, 6.1 for Stamkos, without factoring in the possible situations, I feel pretty good about that projection. It's just Does he want to stay in Tampa Bay? Would he go for a much lower AAV and a long length of contract? Does he go just, it's not going to work in Tampa Bay, so he goes to the highest bidder, which he just scored 40 goals, so a team could get crazy there, and he's won multiple cups. So I don't know. I feel good about our projection. It just wouldn't shock me if that was one of the ones we look at and we're like, wow, we were so off on that one. But what are you going to do?
Yeah. Real quickly before we move on, I do want to get back to Marcia's show a little bit.
Yeah.
So looking at coming off a 40-goal season, $6.3 million for a guy coming off a 40-goal season. Well, we got that for two guys coming off. Again, Marcia's show, there's a level of factor of him staying in Vegas kind of baked into this projection, which isn't exactly maybe correct to do, but it's tough to not do it too. So the one contract that's really kind of dragging this AAV down is Jordan Eberle's recent contract with the Kraken. And we debated a little bit about this, and I can't not factor Jordan Eberle's contract with the Kraken in. They're both very good top six wingers still at 34 years old. Yes, Marcia's show put up more goals. He's also playing with Jack Eichel. Eberle's contract was signed in a tax-free state. Marcia's show, if he were to stay in Vegas, would be in a tax-free state. Eberle took less than market value to basically stay with Seattle. Marcia's show would be taking less than market value to stay with Vegas. So it's baked in a little bit, but I don't think it can be ignored in projecting Marcia's show, because Eberle and he are very, very similar players over the course of their career. And just saying that, no, that's an outlier contract just feels not irresponsible, but it just doesn't feel right.
Yeah, I think in general, very broad, vaguely, we're trying to project a contract that you could expect. We are not projecting multiple different contracts, different numbers for a different amount of years,
or different
signing with different teams, anything like that. We're giving you one contract. So all of those different factors and possibilities, that's we're looking and thinking of all of it. So it gets factored into our number. So yeah, we could be a little low, a little high. I still feel pretty good where we are. I guess we'll call it that group of Kane, Marchessault, and Stamkos. I think it's very reasonable outcomes for those three.
I also, in my mind, was starting to factor in the idea that teams are starting to get smarter.
Yeah.
And giving big contracts to players this age is just not seen as much. I mean, it happens. We just saw what Alex Koren got with Anaheim, 4 years, $6.25 per year. That wouldn't necessarily fall into the not doing smarter things type thing. But Kane, Marchessault, Stamkos, we also that Killorn contract to me also stands out in that's kind of the market value for he's really probably more of a second line, but a top six winger. That's kind of set the market a little bit for a 34-year-old top six winger. I know that these players bring more offensively, but I also feel you can't get too far away from that contract either.
Yeah.
I guess we'll move to the next group of forwards. We'll call these kind of maybe the really good second line two-way guys. This might be where the strength, maybe not strength, but I think the second line guys, there's a flavor for everyone.
Yeah.
So DeBrusk, Bertuzzi, Teravainen, Drouin, down to Matt Duchene, Anthony Mantha, and Victor Arvidsson. I think we'll kind of focus in on those as kind of the second line-ish guys.
I think these guys could really fall similarly to that first group we just talked about as well. Like there isn't a large gap where there's Reinhart at the top and Gensel below. There's really not a large gap between like the Marchessaults, Stamkos, Kane, Toffoli, DeBrusk, everyone you just mentioned. So DeBrusk, that's an interesting one because the past couple of years it was sort of up and down with Boston. But I would almost argue he was never like not good. He just wasn't quite as strong of a clear second line winger. I think that's kind of where he settled. Fairly solid both ends of the ice, which I guess that doesn't differentiate him too much from some of these other names. So it really is like, does one team like a certain player for a certain reason, and that helps make their list. But I don't know, very similar situation. Tyler Bertuzzi, kind of up and down, but was never bad. Underlying numbers are still decent. Good second line winger.
Can I point something out for Tyler Bertuzzi? We've run his projection last offseason, midpoint this season, and now. It has come out almost exactly the same every single time, which speaks to the type of player he is.
Yes.
Over a year and a half, multiple runs through basically our process, we are projecting almost an identical contract each time. A team should be okay giving that contract. So I just want to kind of point out that like that does not happen all the time. I mean, we don't run the players all the time if they're not up for a contract, but we've run him 3 times.
That level of consistency is it doesn't happen for most players. So that is an interesting point to make. I think it speaks to the type of player. He's very well-rounded, and even when he's had his ups and downs, again, the downs haven't been bad. They're just kind of average. This season, I think there was a point where Toronto fans were kind of upset with him. They weren't seeing a ton of the point production. And it was like, well, really, he's been one of your best forwards, and he's actually kind of helping improve the play of some of your more elite, or I guess considered elite players. So absolutely a guy I would be happy signing. Similar type of players, Teuvo Teravainen. I might be a little more concerned with offensive output over the life of the contract, which actually I didn't really even mention contract numbers. DeBrusk, we have 5 by 5.8.
Toffoli was a little bit above DeBrusk, but similar to like exact same thing. Like very good two-way. He was 4 years, $6 million.
A little bit older.
Yep. DeBrusk 5 years, 5.8. And then down to Bertuzzi, 4 years, 5.3 basically. Teravainen, 4 years, a little bit below Bertuzzi. Then we get into kind of the more offensive.
Well,
that's is good.
So here's another player that we had a little bit of back and forth on, trying to figure out where exactly should we settle with him. Jonathan Drouin. So just to get it out there, 4 years, about $5 million.
Yeah.
Pretty much went to Colorado looking for probably the absolute definition of a fresh start. And I think he got it. Even last year, we weren't expecting him to get a big deal. I think we were looking at 1 year worth somewhere in the 1.75 to 2 range was our projection. I think he ended up going minimum or close to minimum.
It was like in the 800,000, so a little bit above minimum.
A little bit above,
I think.
But pretty much, like, essentially minimum. Not quite, but
under $1 million.
Under $1 million. He was really looking for just where's the best fit. And so you mentioned offensive, and we're definitely seeing that with Drouin this year. Defensively, the numbers are there too.
Yes.
So we have to kind of factor in how the past has been, how the past few years have gone. But also, he is performance-wise right in line with the rest of the wingers we just talked about. And you could even argue better than almost every single one of them. Maybe some other ones it's more of like he belongs in the same group, but based on his numbers, he's very good.
If we're looking at just his Colorado year,
Yeah.
he slots right in with Toffoli and DeBrusque.
Yeah.
$6 million ish, right in that range. So we debated him a little bit. I pushed for keeping the AAV above 5. You pushed for a little bit below, but I also had higher term. You pushed for a little lower term. So we kind of, I wouldn't say compromised, but we settled on, knocked, I think, a year off the term that I originally had, but kept the AAV in very similar to what I had.
Yep.
And if I could see him taking a below market deal to stay in Colorado, and that is what it is. And then it's also about where teams think he's at. Like, I want to be careful how I phrase this, because I think physically and mentally, in Montreal especially, he was not in a good spot. He clearly is in a much better spot now in Colorado. If teams will take that for face value, giving him this type of contract should be a no-brainer. If they're comfortable that the performance in Montreal is tied to physical and mental fatigue, basically, in Colorado, getting the fresh start is kind of more his true self, which seems fair to believe. This contract should be absolutely a no-brainer. It's the concern that maybe he's not in Colorado with Nathan McKinnon, who he's been a long time teammate, friend with. That maybe I don't know. I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole here, but
yeah. Well, so I think it is important to kind of flip it and say, with how his career has gone, is it on the table where he would take less for the right fit, where he feels comfortable, whether it's Colorado or another team that he just feels, okay, that's a good place for me to be. I guess you could say that about any player, but that type of mindset feels more possible with Drouin. But looking at the type of player he can be, and that's what we've seen this season, just like all of these other wingers, he should be very much considered as a positive addition for really any team that's needing a second line guy, pretty much. We're at a point where we start to get down into third line. I think we may want to circle around and go towards the defenseman, but before we do that, on the spot, let's pick one name each that's a little bit lower on the list. That's a forward that we really like.
Since it's your idea, you can go first.
I'm going to choose to highlight Jordan Martinook. And so this is an absolute elite fourth liner and probably a very good defensive third line checking player who can actually produce a little bit offensively. I think you're pretty much getting all of the intangibles with him. I think he's considered a leader in Carolina. Very good defensively. Pretty solid offensively. He's not necessarily going to drive play himself, but he is not out of place in the offensive zone. So if you're kind of looking for that almost energy type of player, but also just is very good at hockey, Jordan Martinook should be able to get a fairly decent deal. Our projection is 3 years at about 2.75. So that's one I would be very comfortable with if I'm a team needing a strong impact in the bottom six.
I'm going to cheat and give two quick names.
Yeah.
Warren Fogle and Dakota Joshua would be my two.
Okay.
Fogle I view as he's a third liner who I think could fill in a second line in a pinch,
Yep.
you're not signing him to do that. So we have projected 3 years, $3.9 million basically. And then Joshua, 4 years, $3.25 million. He's really more of a bottom six. Again, they're both third line players. Fogle has a little bit more upside to play higher in the lineup, I think, if necessary, where Joshua, I think you feel fine with him on your third line. Absolutely elite, like fourth line energy type guy. So those would be my two kind of that I'd highlight. Wouldn't be shocked if Joshua did get a little bit more based on playoffs and other kind of intangibles. But let's hit a couple defense and kind of get you on your way. We appreciate you sticking with us this far. So the top of the market. Let me summarize where this projection almost came down to. Is I asked the question, who would you rather sign, Brandon Montour or Brady Shea? And we both kind of settled on Montour slightly, and the fact that he shoots right versus Shea shooting left puts him just above Shea. But the two have basically we're in the same group of comparables, but right shot players generally get a premium, and I think Montour is going to get just a little bit of an intangible bump, right or wrong.
Yep. So Montour, he came in at 6 years, 7.7, and Shea was 5 years, 7.5. So Montour 1 year longer, $200K more a year. It's, I guess, pretty much the difference of right shot versus left shot. It is that premium. Both players I would be fine with signing. So I guess that's nice that the top of the defensive market is comfortable, well, at least in our eyes, what we think will happen, comfortable contracts. Montour is very much someone I think at least we both think could be a power play one quarterback. Shea, I think, can be on the power play. I don't know if he's viewed in the same ilk of offensive defenseman, but he's capable of playing that game and is very strong defensively. That is one that when we looked at over in the middle of the season, I don't know if I was surprised, but just looking into Shea, I kind of had to remind myself how good of a player he was. He is almost hidden a little bit in Carolina.
I do want to say with Montour, especially Shea and Brett Pesce, who we'll get to in a second, and even Matt Roy, who's also in this group, none of these guys have really gotten paid in their career. So, they've
True.
never been showing the money. Montour especially, he's never made his cap hit's never been over $4 million. He's 30 years old, and he's been top 4 upside guy for a long time.
Yeah.
So
also a right winger in Buffalo.
Also a right winger for a little while in Buffalo.
They really fumbled that one.
So the same I said about Reinhart is if he decides to cash in, he might hit the open market and really look for a payday because he hasn't gotten it yet. Anyways, Montour, Shea, both very good. Little bit of a drop to next is basically the Brett Pesce, Matt Roy. Could be one pair, could be first pair, really, really good second pair guys.
Yeah, so Pesce, we have 5 years at about 6.25. Big thing with him, the offensive output points-wise wasn't quite there, but he was still a solid defenseman. I think he's still going to be viewed as kind of in that next tier below Montour and Shea with Matt Roy. So Matt Roy, I would say he's a defenseman we both like a lot. The underlying numbers are pretty solid. So we've got him 5 years at about 5.8. So a little bit lower than Pesce, but still pretty much same group, same ballpark of contract. I would have a little more hesitancy with Pesce because of this season, with the offensive numbers not really being there. It's a little concerning, but still a good defenseman. I don't, with the amount of different options out there in free agency, I probably pass on Brett Pesce. Matt Roy, I like that contract a lot. I feel pretty good age-wise, signing a 5-year contract going into his age 29 season and getting him below $6 million. That's pretty comfortable for a guy who honestly is probably a number 3. Like he could play on a top pair, but he's probably like an ideal number 3 for a team. Anything else you want to say about Pesce and Roy?
Yeah, real quickly, I think I agree with you. I'd rather sign Matt Roy. I would not be surprised if he actually ends up with I might be a little surprised if he ends up with a higher contract, given just a little bit of perception, maybe.
Yeah.
And East Coast, West Coast bias type thing. The comps, though, spoke to having a Pesce projection higher than Matt Roy. Kind of the output that we are getting for our comparable player list, the comps for Pesce were just stronger than Matt Roy. So ultimately, like, I would rather sign Matt Roy for that contract. Like a 5-year, $6 million AAV contract for Matt Roy seems to make perfect sense. I'd rather do that, but stuck with the process, kind of our process with this. Comps were just speaking more so to Pesce getting the slight bump up, but I'd rather sign Matt Roy.
Yeah, I agree.
Do a couple more,
yeah.
I guess, like second pair guys, and then we'll wrap and maybe hit more guys in the future.
Yep, absolutely. So we kind of went from a top group of Montour Shea, the next group Pesce, Roy, and I think there's kind of another drop into another group where we have Nikita Zadorov. Again, a polarizing player where some people kind of look at his style and I think say, oh, okay, bottom pair defenseman. But he plays some big minutes. He flashes every once in a while with some offense. And I think as the end of the season went on, because he was traded to Vancouver early, not at the deadline. It was a bit before. And I think as the season went on and into the playoffs, it seems like Vancouver fans went from being a little iffy on Zadorov to, okay, maybe like this guy should be part of our core. Like we love this guy.
He's an absolute fan favorite at this point.
Yeah. So I think while that doesn't really matter, I think it in a way helps with perception a little bit because he's playing very well alongside of it. This led to a deal of 5 years at about 5.3 for Zadorov, which a couple of years ago I would have said no way, but he's kind of become a very strong defensive defenseman who every once in a while can kind of chip in some offense.
I consider him at this point a firm second pair guy.
Yeah.
And I think that type of contract for a firm second pair guy is correct.
Yeah.
Speaking of other firm second pair guys in this type of contract, Dylan DeMello as well.
Oh, I skipped DeMello.
Yeah, but basically the exact same. 4 years, 5.3. So really the difference, DeMello's a couple years older.
Yep.
So a little bit less term, a little more AAV. Right shot as well versus Zadorov. But again, another defensive defenseman, stay at home type guy. Just really solid. Just really solid defensively. Really solid second pair guy.
Yeah. So and I want to say when we're calling these guys second pair, and even with Matt Roy and Brett Pesce, depending on the style the team plays, these are guys that could technically be on a top pair. A lot of times when you look at time on ice, the top pair guys that you would consider, they have really at 5-on-5, a top 4 on a team has very similar numbers, and it tends to be the special teams where the true elite guys then bump up a little bit more. And part of that is just how guys fit together. If a team needs a shutdown defenseman next to an elite offensive guy, and that's the type of pair they want to create and the style of play that they need. These guys are capable of that. They play those 5-on-5 minutes. So I think the style of defenseman, the level of output puts them in the group that they're in. But if I don't know the exact example, but just looking around the league, you could see different players like a Makar or a Heiskanen play with other players that aren't viewed as top pair guys, but the fit and the style of play works, and guys are capable of playing those minutes.
And then I think you also just have to kind of think about, well, okay, team gets a lead. Your Matt Roys, your Dylan DeMellos, your Nikita Zadorovs are getting more ice time as you try to hold on to that lead.
Yep.
Versus you're behind, your Brandon Montours get more ice time trying to push the offense. I know that he's a little bit higher tier, but like that's kind of how it goes.
A player of similar tier we have slightly lower is Shane Gostisbehere.
Yeah, he's probably the one I should have used.
There's
you're
your
behind.
offensive guy
Exactly.
that you probably have take a little bit less shifts and you play Zadorov instead.
Correct. Yep. So Gostisbehere, I will finish up with two names here because I feel like not finishing up with Chris also talking about a little bit Chris Tanev would be a mistake. So Shane Gostisbehere, actually I guess maybe three. Gostisbehere, Sean Walker.
Yep.
Very similar type of player. Gostisbehere, I think bigger sample size of higher play gets him a little bit higher projection, and he also had a little bit better season recently. But both are like the three. So Gostisbehere, we have 3 years, just under $5 million. Sean Walker, 3 years, $4.6 million. And then right below Walker, Chris Tanev, who I jokingly said we could be way off. 3 years, 4.5 basically. Feels good. That feels like a good projection. But he could stay in Dallas and take less. He could pull like a Mark Giordano, stay in Dallas, or he could go to Toronto and take less to go to Toronto. Or back to Vancouver.
So, yeah, he could very much take less just to win. In theory, I guess he could take way more with a team. Like, I know you had mentioned Ottawa, and that was a rumor. I don't really see that happening. But in theory, like I guess it could happen, and you could argue he's worth more. The other factor here that I think is important to mention is his age.
Yes.
So when his value might be more than 4.5, but over the life of a contract at that age, once you start talking 2, 3, 4 years, the level of the AAV, the longer you go, might actually start to shrink a little bit. And I think that's where what we're projecting him at is pretty much where he's been at the past, I think, 4 years on his current contract, about 4.5. So I think that's where we ultimately kind of settled as, okay, that feels comfortable. But like you mentioned, there's different reasons that it could go more, it could go less. It's hard to predict that.
It's probably something I shouldn't have saved for the end of the long episode, but if you're looking at the ages, this is the kind of calendar year age, which is absolutely fine for almost all the players. Yeah. For some of the ones that are listed at age 35, though, it was a little tricky.
That's true.
So I was the one handling most of the unrestricted free agents, so I had to kind of check myself a lot of times. Sure. July 1st is a hard cutoff date for 35-plus-year-old contracts. So if you were 35 prior to July 1st, so this year, 1989 birthday before July 1st, you're eligible to sign a 35-plus contract. You turn 35 after July 1st, so you're born 1989, but later in the year, you are not getting a 35 plus contract, meaning you can't potentially include performance bonuses on a 1-year contract. So I had to,
Do we change the age calc in our document?
well, we've already released this, so as we might have changed the age, we might have decided to change the age a little bit, but between recording this and releasing.
If you're hearing this now and you haven't checked the contract doc, look at Chris Tanev's age.
We'll have a disclaimer at the top, regardless, to make sure this is very clear. But regardless if we change how it's presented or not, that is an important line to draw, is that July 1st is a hard deadline for being 35 and eligible to sign a 35-plus contract.
Correct.
Because Patrick Kane, when he signed with Detroit, was almost 35 years old when he could have waited another week or two to sign it and would have turned 35, but it didn't matter because he wasn't 35 as of July 1st. So
yep.
Probably shouldn't have saved this for super late in a long episode, but also important to talk about. Goalies real quickly.
Yeah.
We're running quite long, but
so
there's no one. No,
if you need a starter, you need to go listen to our trade episodes that were released prior to this. If you need a 1B, you could maybe talk yourself into Samsonov, Nedeljkovic. That might maybe a Capo Kakinen. And then some good backups are out there. Looking at a Stolars, Laurent Brossoit, even like the Kevin Lankinen. Oh, I should have mentioned Cam Talbot with the 1Bs, or maybe just a good backup. Basically, if you need a backup, there's some options. You're fine. If you need a starter, you need to look to the trade market.
Can I say that I'm having nightmares talking about the goalies because figuring out where the Samsonov to DeSmith Reimer line was an absolute nightmare. And David Rittich actually has already signed a 1-by-1.
Yeah.
We were a little high on him, but not bad. I feel pretty good about where that projection was, but the line trying to figure out how these guys should slot relative to each other, but also in the general marketplace and what a fair market value was really fun. Let me tell you.
It's definitely tough when there isn't an obvious starter to kind of give that. I'm looking for just a benchmark contract to compare to. Yeah. I look at this and I feel pretty good about where we ended up value-wise. But even in last off season, there were guys who went way lower than they probably should have gone for, at least I would say. So we'll see. Goalies are maybe even a little tougher, but
my guess is I think we're pretty good on most of these. I'm going to guess, and I don't know what name it is, one or two get a bigger contract to be more of a true 1A/B option.
Jonas Korpisalo.
Yes, that was the comp that kept coming up in these. But to me, I'm looking probably most likely Samsonov or Nedeljkovic.
Yeah.
I think one of those might set the bar a little bit higher, and maybe everyone filters in a little bit under that. But again, this was tough.
Yeah.
Yeah, so a team could talk themselves into the so let me tell real quickly the trade-off kind of going on here is Nedeljkovic, Samsonov had stretches as the starter, the clear starter. Talbot stretches as the clear starter, but older.
Yep.
Stolars, Brossoit, very good performance numbers, but very clearly backup as far as games went.
Yep.
Kakinen and Lankinen are basically the same goalie. A potential 1B. Stats, they were comps for each other.
Yeah.
And then Scott Wedgwood actually has been a very solid backup lately, the last couple of years. And then Casey DeSmith, James Reimer, getting a little bit older, both of them are really backups at this point.
Yeah, fine backups.
But balancing really the who were starters versus who put up the best numbers but were clear backups versus who could actually be signed as a like a 1B option. Good. Yeah, it was a near impossible task. So we'll see how these turn out. I feel good, but 1 or 2 I expect to be not quite off, but I think 1 or 2 is going to be one of the like outliers in the list.
I could very much see someone gets paid like they're a starter, like you said, close to 1A. We'll see.
Or someone like a Brossois takes less to stay in Winnipeg.
True. Or Stolar's less to stay in Florida.
Correct. So
who knows?
I think we better end this episode here. So we appreciate you listening to our discussion on the contract projections. Obviously, we're passionate. You can tell we like what we're talking about. Probably get another episode or 2, and we'll definitely hit on RFAs. Maybe we'll do a little bit of the bargain bin shopping at some point as well, because we didn't get into that as much. But yeah, we appreciate you listening. Getting contract projections live on X at AFPAnalytics. Follow along there. We'll be tweeting tons of content out. Welcome your interaction, welcome your questions, and subscribe to Max Turn Podcast to know when kind of some of the future episodes related to the discussion drop. And with that, we'll talk to you next time.